Hey there, friends. My name is Cassie Stevens, and today we are going to be exploring 4 totally unique and unusual ways to use your crayons. We are going to be using, of course, our Prang crayons. So grab your Prang crayons and some paper and join me as I share with you 4 totally unusual, different, and unique ways to use your crayons. Let's go.
Let's first begin by creating something called a faux batik. You're going to begin with a small square piece of paper, preferably 4-inch square or 6-inch. You'll also need a pencil, a permanent marker, and of course, your crayons. To begin, you're going to draw something simple, and I'm drawing a flower. The steps on how to draw a folk art flower are also going to be provided, so don't worry. Right now, let's just focus on the drawing portion. Draw yourself a large-ish, simple design, and then once that design is complete, you're going to grab a permanent marker and trace over all of those pencil lines. It's important that the marker is permanent. You'll dive in from there using your Prang crayons, and you want to make sure that when you're coloring, you press very, very firmly. We want to give the paper a very shiny and waxy finish, and that can only be done by pressing really hard with the crayons. Once your drawing is complete, you're going to take it, and as crazy as it sounds, crumple it up into a very small, tight wad of paper. Do this kind of slowly because you don't want to accidentally tear the paper. Then just as slowly, uncrumple the paper and flatten it onto, I would say, a tray or newspaper, because from here, things are going to get a little messy, hence the gloves. I'm using a bingo dauber filled with ink. If you don't have that, you could simply use a cup and paint the ink on. If you don't have ink, try acrylic paint that's been diluted so that it has an inky consistency. You'll cover the whole drawing, but you'll want to work quickly. Then take the tray over to a sink and rinse off the ink. If doing this in a classroom, I would definitely use a tray so that students can carry their artwork easily. You're left behind with a really cool masterpiece where the ink has gone into the cracks that were created when the paper was crumpled, thus making a crayon batik. Another fun thing to do with crayons is texture rubbing, and for that, I like to create my own texture rubbing shapes. I made these with poster board and hot glue probably about 10 years ago, and my students have been using and loving them ever since. So grab yourself some poster board or some tag board and a hot glue gun. These little rectangles were cut to 2.5 by 3-inch rectangles, and then depending on what it is your students are going to be learning, that can be the theme of what you draw with your hot glue. So if my students are doing a lot of study of pattern, perhaps I could create patterns on these little pieces of paper. If I were doing letters or numbers, shapes, lines, all of those things could work great for making my very own little texture rubbing tools for my students. So let your imagination go wild and create your own set or multiple sets of texture rubbing tools. The other thing you'll need to have on hand for this is you're going to need some crayons that have the paper peeled off. That is not a fun task to do it manually, so here's my suggestion. Throw those Prang crayons in some water, add a tiny little bit of soap, and let it soak overnight. When you come back in the morning, the paper will slide right off, and the next thing you know, you've got crayons that are ready for rubbing. Put the little texture rubbing tool underneath the paper, and my students were really able, even down to kindergarten, to use their fingers to feel the texture of the rubbing plate underneath so they could understand exactly where they were placing it. Now, the reason I did mine 2.5 by 3 inches is because that means that these little rectangles can fill the entire sheet of a 9 by 12 piece of paper. Now, for the next thing to do with your crayons is crayon resist. So we just did rubbing where we rubbed the crayon all over the paper. It created that waxy buildup, and that wax is going to push off any of the watercolor paint that I'm using, thus creating a wax resist. It's resisting the color, baby color. I'm using my Prang watercolor paint here. This works best if you make sure to dilute the watercolor paint as you go. You want it to be nice and translucent. Now, with all that creating, you might have some crayons that are down to the nubs. Instead of just throwing those crayons away, why not melt them down and make brand new ones? For this, you're going to need some silicone candy trays that you can find at the craft store. And of course, you're going to need crayons that don't have any paper on them. So if you're looking for a way to do that easily, I recommend soaking your crayons in water overnight with a tiny bit of soap. The next morning, the paper wrapper will slide right off. It does help if you break the crayons up quite a bit. And I like to sort my crayons: warm, which is red, orange, yellow, and pink, and cool colors, which are green, blue, and purple. And then I even made some crayons that were all warm or all cool, but I actually like the crayons that I created where I mixed all of the colors together. Now, here's the deal. When you make these, you could use something like a mallet to smash your crayons, but I highly recommend doing that outside in a folded sheet of newspaper. That way the crayons aren't going everywhere. It would be a really fun activity for kids to do as long as you're hanging out with them and watching them. When you fill up these trays, the more colors you add, the better. I thought that the tiny little pieces would work out better, but they actually melt a little too much and blend in with the other colors, so bigger chunks work great. Meanwhile, go ahead and preheat your oven to 250. When you're finished, set this on a cookie sheet and put it in your oven, keeping a close eye on it. I thought it would take maybe 10-15 minutes. It only took a few minutes before the crayons melted down and looked like this. If I had let it go a little bit too long, I have a feeling that the colors would have gotten more mixed up. Now, this is a mistake that I made. After letting it cool, I tried to pop it out and it broke. So here's a hot tip. Once they've cooled, put them in the freezer for about, I would say, 15 minutes and let them get completely cool. And then they're going to pop out of those trays a whole lot easier without breaking. I will say that probably picking a tray that had all those little curves made it a little bit more tricky. So when you're shopping for those silicone trays, maybe look for a more simple shape without a lot of curves, perhaps a heart or a circle or something a little simpler. But look, it still worked. They still turned out great. I really do think the freezer trick was where it's at. Now you have these cute little homemade crayons that are great for kids to color with, or they even make great gifts. I did notice something cool, that because there's so many colors on them, when you do color, a lot of times a couple of colors will show. So it's a little bit magical when you're using them. And it's a great way to reuse those crayons.
And there you have it. I hope you've enjoyed these 4 activities. I hope you found something that really sparks your imagination, gets those creative juices going, and inspires you to grab your crayons, especially your Prang crayons, and get started. Toodles!